Welcome back. Eddie Radosevich, George Stoya here from the SoonerScoop.com studios. Welcome back to the SoonerScoop.com YouTube channel. A lot has happened since we last talked. Oklahoma has a prospective new defense coordinator. We know for sure Ted Roof is out after 2 seasons. That news comes out on Thursday. A really good show lined up for you here. We were joined by Tyler Waldrip from the Anniston Star. He's covered Jacksonville State over the last 2 seasons, and more importantly, has covered Zac Alley, who we have reported on SoonerScoop.com. It is believed that he will be the next defense coordinator in Norman. George, welcome to the program. On a day that we thought, there might be a couple transfer portal items to talk about. Didn't exactly expect to hear that Ted Roof is out at Oklahoma after 2 seasons.
Yeah, pretty surprising, especially considering, I think it was about a month ago that we kind of heard that there wasn't going to be a change there. And then you talked to Ted Roof last week at the Alamo Bowl in San Antonio, and he basically said, I'm not going anywhere. So I wonder how much maybe he was blindsided by this. But I do think that this was a decision that, Brent Venables took a step back after the season. He evaluated the program. He said, hey, where can we be better? And I think he looked at that position and said, he's taken on a huge role this year. I mean, he was the defensive play caller for Oklahoma, Brent Venables, this year. And I think that he said, I need to focus on being more of a head coach. And that, to me, is what I've heard from multiple people inside the program, that he wanted to take a step back in the sense that, hey, I need to be the head coach, and I need to bring somebody in that can be the defensive coordinator and kind of take over the reins. And, the belief is that he thinks that Zac Alley can be that guy. Young guy, obviously from Jacksonville State. He's been the defensive coordinator there the last 2 years. But more importantly, spent, I think it was 8 seasons at Clemson as both a student assistant and graduate assistant under Brent Venables. And from my understanding, was attached at the hip with Brent during his time at Clemson. So somebody he's very familiar with. But I think ultimately, Eddie, this was a decision by Brent to say, hey, thank you, Ted Roof, for what you've done the last couple years, but we need to bring somebody in here that he can trust to run the defense, can call the plays, and also be a great recruiter. I know we talked to Josh about that a little bit later in the show, but I do think that that was a big part of this. Ted Roof wasn't somebody that was out a ton on the recruiting trail all the time. So I think that all played into this decision.
In terms of what we know about Zac Alley, I think that he was a name that you obviously listed on the hot board from the get-go. He was a guy that a lot of people out there that certainly Josh has been a big fan of Zac Alley and what he's done at Louisiana Monroe in the last 2 seasons at Jacksonville State. Working under Rich Rodriguez. You look at the numbers, it's excellent. I mean, Jacksonville State was playing very, very good defense. A couple things that I think a lot of people are going to wonder about. How do you make the move from Jacksonville State to Oklahoma? That's probably number one, and especially at 29, 30 years old. The other side of it is you're now playing in the SEC, making the jump from the Sun Belt, I believe, to what is now the SEC. There's going to be a lot of questions that are asked, certainly of Brent Venables, and particularly probably of Zac Alley. Simply, is he ready to make this jump?
I think a couple things work in his favor. One, he's incredibly intelligent. From the people I've talked to, even going back to his high school days, this is a guy that knows football. I mean, he was drawing up plays back for his high school. He was helping Brent Venables put together game plans.
When he was in high school?
Yes, correct. Like, he was scheming things up. They ended up winning the state championship, I believe, when he was a junior there at Charlotte Country Day School is the name of the high school that he went to. He played center and linebacker, Eddie. He was actually a pretty talented offensive player, from my understanding. Goes to Clemson, becomes a student assistant as a freshman, and really attached himself to Brent Venables, like I said. Started putting together play sheets, game plans, all that sorts of stuff. Basically lived in Brent's office for 8 years there at Clemson. And so he really understands the game. He runs Brent Venables' defense. That's what he's run, whether when he went to Boise State as the linebackers coach, but then when he took over as the defensive coordinator at Louisiana Monroe, he ran Brent's defense, and then obviously the last 2 years at Jacksonville State. The other things that are working for him, Eddie, he's come into a situation that is pretty good. I mean, we talked a lot about the experience that's coming back from Oklahoma. He steps into a situation where you've got a Danny Stutzman, you've got a Billy Bowman, Woody Washington, DJ Terry, Jacob Lacey, Ethan Downs. The list goes on. And I think that that's going to make the transition a lot smoother. These guys understand the defense. Some of the terminology might be different, but in terms of what they're doing schematically, it's going to be very, very similar to what Brent's been doing. It's just, hey, this is a young guy. I think he's going to be able to connect, and I think he brings a lot of energy. You watch the clips of him, at Jacksonville State and Louisiana Monroe. It's like you're watching Brent Venables out there, just a little bit younger version. So I think that this is a really smart hire. And again, we'll see what happens. He hasn't done it at this level. I get that, but he has been in a big program. He's won 2 national championships. Whether it was a GA or not, he played an important role on those staffs. He's seen what it looks like. He knows what Brent wants. And so he checks right now all the boxes on paper.
Sure. You hear the word mentor in terms of the relationship between Brent Venables and Zac Alley. You hear the word protege has been thrown around. And we got into this conversation with Josh McCuistion. You'll see on the backside of the this show today. But just in terms of believing that Brent can let go of something like that, I think that that's been something that has been talked about on the message boards quite a bit. It's been talked about on social media. Can Brent do that? Can he allow somebody to come in and take a almost not necessarily a hands-off approach? Because I don't think that there's anybody that wants Brent Venables not to have any word on what kind of defense they're. But do you trust the idea that he can step away, let Zac Alley, like, how much of this is based off just knowing the trust between those two? It's like, okay, yeah, maybe this is the time that Brent can do that.
It makes a lot of sense in terms of where Zac comes from and their relationship.
Sure.
But I think that it had to be the perfect guy for this to happen and for this to happen right now with the transition to the SEC. But this is something we've talked with Brent for a long time. I mean, think about after the Alamo Bowl. This was a discussion I think I brought up on the post-game podcast is, can Brent realize that he doesn't need to be a part of the defense all the time? And I think that this move signals that. And I know there's been a lot of fans that say, hey, Brent needs to focus more on being the head coach. You saw that with Bob Stoops. You see that with coaches across the country when you think about the Nick Sabans and the Kirby Smarts of the world. All they've done is gone out and hired great assistants that have gone on to be head coaches. You look at what Kirby Smart's done at Georgia. And I'm not saying that Zac Alley's the next Dan Lanning, but there are people that believe that. And he did the same thing with Mel Tucker. You look what Nick Saban's done with all of his assistants. There's a game plan for this, right? There's a what's the term?
Blueprint?
A blueprint for this. Thank you, Eddie.
I'm
That's
the words guy.
Exactly. But there is a blueprint in college football for successful programs. You look at what Michigan's doing under Jim Harbaugh. I think that's what Brent saw is that, hey, as good as he is as a defensive coordinator, maybe the best in the country, he knows he needs to focus on being a head coach. We talk about game management all the time. I think he realizes that Oklahoma needs better in that area. I think he also realizes that, hey, sometimes he might need to help out with the offense. He might need to help out with special teams with how bad they were this year. There's so many
that was
things.
something that he did at Boise State under Brian Harsin. He was a special teams coach.
Exactly. And Boise State had a really good special teams unit under his direction. So I think that he looked at everything and said, I need to focus on other things in the program. You bring somebody in like a Zac Alley that you trust to do the game planning and things like that. And that's not to say Brent won't be involved. We all know Brent Venables is going to be involved. And I think the first time we go out to spring practice, you're still going to see him over there helping out with the linebackers. He's going to be with the safeties. And maybe that gives him some more time to hop over to some other positions and help out other groups. So I think that this, again, is one of those moves that we might look back in a few years and say, man, that was a smart move by Brent Venables to step back and kind of do what Bob Stoops did when he first became the Oklahoma coach. I mean, he brought in guys that he trusted to run the offense. He brought in a 29-year-old Brent Venables to help run the defense along with his brother Mike Stoops. So I think that this is a really smart move by Brent and one that, again, I think that moving forward, we'll see how it works out, but I think that there's a lot of people that have a lot of confidence in a guy like Zac Alley.
To reset, it's not official. We've reported out there that Zac Alley is going to be the next defensive coordinator at Oklahoma, just basically waiting on the press release to be sent out from Oklahoma. It seems like it is literally a matter of time before that happens.
Yeah.
At some point, we will get a chance to an opportunity to talk to Zac Alley about the move, about his relationship with Brent Venables, all that good stuff. What would be your number one question for Zac Alley right now as he enters a program that, obviously will be the biggest job that he's taken? It'll be the task at hand will be the biggest thing that he's undertaken, and as far as making this transition into the SEC with what you talked about in a really good defense. What would be some of the questions that you would have for Zac Alley when we meet him?
I think there's a couple things. One is his comfortability calling a defense at a place like Oklahoma. Like I said, he's done it at Jacksonville State and Louisiana Monroe at a high level, and that's a big step to do that at 27 years old when he was hired at Louisiana Monroe. I mean, I don't care what program it is. Being 27, I'm 27. I don't think I could do that at an
Well,
FBS
you're selling
program.
yourself short.
Yeah, that's true. But I think that's the number one thing. It's a big step up. How comfortable are you stepping into that role, especially in the shadow of somebody like Brent Venables, who has been one of the best defensive coordinators the last few years. I think it's also, what have you learned from Brent? What is that relationship like? What was it like at Clemson? And then I think the big one, and Josh gets into it a little bit later, is recruiting. And that's something that, look, he's called defenses before. The last 3 years he's called it. And so he knows how to call a game and call in defensive play calls. But what does it look like recruiting at a place like Oklahoma versus a place like Jacksonville State? And I think programs like that, you're going in the portal a lot. You're probably not as much on the high school recruiting trail. You're not going after the 5-star linebacker, the 5-star defensive lineman. What does that look like? And I think everybody points to his energy and his personality as something that they feel that he can connect with those players and do a good job on the recruiting trail. But I want to hear it from him. What's his pitch? What does he sound like sitting in those living rooms and talking to those kids? Because that's the ultimate piece for me. Ted Roof wasn't somebody that was heavily involved, I think, in the recruiting side. I think Zac Alley will be, and so I wonder what does that look like for him as he steps into a massive role for Oklahoma.
Very much so. Let's get to the interviews. We talked to Tyler Waldrip from the Anniston Star. He's covered Jacksonville State over the last 2 years. Covered Zac Alley as far as everything that they have in terms of a defense that statistically, metric-wise, fascinating. Very, very good at the level that Jacksonville State was obviously playing at. It's going to be interesting to see kind of how all this comes together.
Yeah.
And we also talked to Josh McCuistion as well to get his ideas and thoughts on Oklahoma's change at defensive coordinator. So, without further ado, here's our conversation with Tyler Waldrip from the Anniston Star. Tyler, thanks for joining us. Figured there would be nobody better to talk about Zac Alley and the new hire in Norman than yourself. You've covered him over the last 2 seasons at Jacksonville State, and I think we'll just start here. Who is Zac Alley?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, Zac is one of the youngest coordinators in the country. He's a guy I actually expected to be making a move at this point of the year. I didn't know it was going to be Oklahoma when things got started here in August. But, I mean, to start off with, he's a guy that turned Jacksonville State, a first-year FBS program, into a defense that I think legitimately might be a top 40 defense in the whole country. And that's not something I expected coming into this year. Rich Rod spent all, the last 12 months basically telling anybody who would listen, Jacksonville State's going to be undersized. They're not going to be as fast. And I mean, there are times when you saw that, but it just didn't matter with the way Zac Alley schemed things up.
Tyler, tell us about the way that he did scheme things up. I mean, what kind of defense is this? We know he's obviously a Brent Venables prodigy. I mean, he's a guy that, Brent's very close with. I'm sure they run a very similar defense, but what kind of defense is it? And I'm not just talking schematics, but how do they play?
Yeah, the thing that impressed me the most that people might not realize if you just go look up the stats is this defense played 2 deep at almost every position. There were 2 traditional linebackers that the team kind of relied on, but at every other position, Jacksonville State was leaning on not 1, but 2 guys. And no matter whether it was a first string corner in or a second string guy, like Zac ran a lot of man in the secondary. Jacksonville State had a couple starters go down in the middle and the back half of the season, and you didn't see Zac adjust too much. He kind of just kept calling the same defense, which put a lot on those guys on the back end, and those guys loved that. They loved playing for Zac. But I would expect, I don't know how much of this was specific to Jacksonville State's strength, because I do think one of the strengths for the Gamecocks was the secondary. But, I would expect he'll probably ask the corners and the safeties to do a lot at Oklahoma as well. That seems like the type of defense, at least from what I've seen, that he wants to run. He wants the secondary to kind of, I guess, take the brunt of things and sort of everybody else kind of fills in. That's what I saw this year.
I think that one of the things that comes up, as George said, he's basically a protege of Brent Venables. How many times over the last 2 years did you have discussions with him about Brent and just kind of his mentorship, whether it be at Clemson or throughout the last couple of years as he elevated himself and kept moving up the ranks to where he is today?
Yeah, we didn't talk a lot about Brent. Zac had been away from Clemson for several years by the time, we're talking to him. A lot of our discussions were focused on his relationship with Rich Rodriguez, who he followed from Louisiana Monroe. So just in terms of mentors, we focused more of the discussions on that. That was more present to kind of what he was going through now. And I will say, whenever we tried to get Zac to open up about, the way he calls things or more of his philosophical beliefs, the thing he would push us towards, which I'm sure is some of why would I get too in the weeds about my X's and O's, but he talked a lot about player leadership and mentors. For him, the thing he kept mentioning was, one of the first things I'm told he did when he got the job at Jacksonville State is start kind of a big brother program. And he pushed, he matched up all the younger guys, with an older player on the team. And that's kind of the thing he kept talking about. Again, I'm sure that was twofold. I think that was important to him, but I'm also sure he was like, well, I don't want to get too in my playbook right now, especially with somebody who's going to write this up later.
That sounds like Brent, something like that.
100%.
That type of program. But tell us a little bit. I mean, I know recruiting at Jacksonville State is probably a lot different than it is at a place like Oklahoma, but what kind of relationship builder was he? I mean, is he somebody that was constantly on the recruiting trail? And what kind of personality does he have that maybe connects with younger guys?
Yeah, I'll say actually the biggest thing that we heard talking to recruits and guys that joined Jacksonville State, Zac seemed to do the best in the portal. We had a lot of guys join from other FBS programs. And when we asked those guys, hey, why did you pick Jacksonville State of all, out of everywhere you could have gone in the country, why Jack State? And Zac Alley was the guy that came up the most, even more than Rich Rodriguez. No matter there were guys we said, hey, what about Rich Rod made you come here? And they would stop us and say, well, actually it was Zac that got me to come here. So I think Zac might be a guy, I do think he's a great recruiter. I have a lot of, conversations with high school kids that really bonded with Zac. I think they like his energy. I think they like his youth. The fact that he's, closer to them in age than some of the other guys that are going to be recruiting them as coordinators. But I mean, the thing that we had is just, the older guys that are transferring in, those are the guys that seem to really click with Zac. And I don't know how much of that is maybe that's Zac's role with Jacksonville State was maybe to go after those guys a little more, or I don't know if that's just the guy that ended up connecting with these kids. But I mean, the transfer portal guys are the guys that really talk to us over and over again about Zac. So that really stands out as far as recruiting. But not to say he can't recruit high school kids. I had a number of high school guys that, said they bonded with him as well. So I think his youth is probably the thing that stands out. That and the people we talked to said they really like Zac's honesty. And, apparently he's pretty upfront with the guys that, hey, I'm going to ask you to do a lot, especially going back to, guys in the secondary, the corners and the safeties. He's pretty upfront that he's going to ask him to do a lot.
I think the age thing is something that a lot of people, if they just look at the bio and they go, oh my God, this guy's 29, 30 years old, and he's already moved up the ranks to get to Oklahoma. And in the last 2 years, has the age thing, do you ever have a moment where it's like, damn, this guy is 29, 30 years old. He is very, very young and still rather green at the position, while being that what you look on paper and what the numbers bear itself. He's been excellent, it seems.
I mean, he's my age, so I'm looking around and going like, where in life did my path divert from what Zac did that I could have ended up as a coordinator at a major college program? I mean, that's the thing that stands out when you talk to him. He's a guy that, unless you're talking to Zac Alley, just because of how, I mean, he looks maybe even a little bit younger than you would think he is. So unless you're talking to Zac Alley, you could walk by him and not even realize that's who you're talking to. But I mean, then just his energy on the sideline, you can see it. I will say perhaps the biggest surprise is, when you talk to the players about how he acts on the sidelines, we see him from the press box. We see him amped up. We see him constantly going over to follow up with a guy after a mistake or after the defense gets a turnover. But the guys kind of describe Alley as a little bit more of a low-key coordinator, not a guy that is going to, scream and really harp on them after a mistake. Now, he's being compared to Rich Rod. So perhaps everybody's going to seem a little low key next
the bar's
to Richrod.
different.
He will certainly get after. Yeah, I think the bar is a little different. So, Oklahoma might feel a little bit differently about him. They might feel like, man, Alley will get after you after a mistake. But the thing we heard when asking guys is that, he kind of points out what you did wrong, but he's not a guy that's going to hound you and going to yell. He wasn't a guy people were afraid to talk to on the sidelines after a mistake. That wasn't always the case with Rich Rodriguez, although I think anybody who's seen him on TV in the last couple years probably realizes that.
Tyler, last one from me. There's been a lot of people asking how old is Zac Alley actually? Because we've had several people report different ages. Some people saying he's 29, some people saying 30. Do you have his birth certificate, and do you know how old he actually is?
I don't have his birth certificate. I know that, when he joined Jacksonville State in late December, maybe this week in January in 2022, he was 28, I believe. So that's what I'm going off of. I know he was 28 at Louisiana Monroe, so
okay.
Should have been 28, 29 when he joined in 2022. But no, I don't have his birth certificate. And in the limited time we've got with Zac over the last 2 years, I didn't spend a lot of time drilling down on his age or his social security number or anything else. Although now that he's going to be making that Oklahoma money, maybe I should have asked more bank questions.
Sure.
Just in case.
This isn't the first time that George has been after somebody's birth certificate, if you know what I mean. Tyler, we appreciate it, man. Thanks for joining us today and familiarizing us with Zac Alley as he makes the move to Norman. We appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, guys. I appreciate y'all having me on, and congrats to Oklahoma. I think they got a really good coordinator. I'm excited to see what happens.
Very good. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Tyler.
Thanks.
Once again, a special thank you to Tyler Waldrip from the Anniston Star, getting a little bit of more familiarity with Zac Alley. I think somebody that doesn't need too much, certainly of an introduction, but an intro to Zac Alley, because I don't think that there is anybody a bigger fan than him of him than the great Josh McCuistion. Josh, welcome into the program. Crazy news on Thursday with the drop that Ted Roof is out after 2 years. Zac Alley is, expected to be in as Oklahoma's new defense coordinator. He's a guy that you've talked about quite a bit, whether it be on the Crimson Corner, on the message boards, the unofficial 40, just about anywhere that you could talk about him. I know that you're a big fan. Just kind of your overall thoughts on everything that went down in Norman on Thursday.
Yeah, first off, with the Roof thing, I mean, guys, I'm not going to try to pretend that that hire confused me when it was made. Like, I didn't think that was the direction that they needed to go. I thought Roof's background was a little questionable. So I think this was the right move for Oklahoma. I think they needed to find someone that not only could take the reins of defensive coordinator, and I know he's got a lot of experience, but there's a track record that says that's not always been a huge success for Ted Roof. But more obviously, with my focus being recruiting, I just needed to see Oklahoma have a little bit more success recruiting at the linebacker position. Hearing when it's a coordinator, guys, it's not just about, does he recruit linebackers well? Like, what is he doing for your overall staff? Is he the guy that can come in and help you close that safety from Texas, or, the defensive end from, wherever, Mississippi, wherever it may be? Oklahoma's got to have a guy that has that level of ability to sell a kid on a vision and what the program can be, obviously playing in the SEC. Now, we'll get into the hire a little bit here and the questions that are going to exist within that. But again, I just think Ted Roof was a guy that didn't have the cachet to convince a lot of these guys, hey, this is the answer for you. And it's not to say that kids didn't like him. They absolutely did. But if you're going to go win those elite battles against the Alabamas and Georgias and Clemsons of the world, you've got to have a guy that when he walks in the room, kids they perk up. They kind of know who they're looking at.
And I think Josh, and I said this in the intro, but, Brent, I think, realized that he needed to have someone that he can hand the reins to defensively and say, hey, you're going to run the show. He trusts him to do that. I mean, we can get into Zac's background in a little bit, and I've talked to quite a few people that know him pretty well. But I think that this is an overall for the program, moving forward, it frees Brent up to be the head coach. And not to say that he hasn't been the last 2 years, but I think he's been so sucked into the defense and turning them around. I mean, we even heard it earlier this year, him kind of talking about, he wants to be more involved with the defense because he felt like they underperformed a year ago. He did that this year. I'm sure he reevaluated everything this offseason, the last month now since the season ended, and said, hey, I need to be more in tune with what the overall program is doing and not have to, run the defense every single day. And that's what I think Zac makes a lot of sense, because I know he doesn't have a ton of experience. The last 3 years now, defensive coordinator at Louisiana Monroe in 2021, and the last 2 years at Jacksonville State. But this is a guy that knows what Brent wants, is going to do what Brent wants, and I think can also go into people's houses and recruit people. I mean, he's a guy that has a lot of energy. I mean, we just talked to Tyler about it. He talked that he's been really good in the portal, which, Oklahoma and Jacksonville State, I'm sure Jacksonville State's a program that they have to go get guys in the portal to compete, and he's been able to do that. But I think he's also going to be really good recruiting high school kids.
Yeah, you look at that, and some of that with Jacksonville State, guys, you look at the guys they're going to lose most of the time are going to bigger programs. They had a really successful year this year. So he's got to go identify talent at even smaller schools, whether it's the D2 level, wherever it may be. He's got to go find guys that are really, underrated, underappreciated, and then bring them in to Jacksonville State and really try to find something that works. So I think that has its advantages on a couple of different levels because, again, with my focus in recruiting, you're going to talk about identification of talent. You're going to talk about ability to develop talent. But in this era of the portal, I would guess he's done more juggling and trying to figure out who his roster is from week to week and year to year than any coach at Oklahoma has probably ever had to do. So I would guess he's very good at trying to build a culture kind of on the fly, which is almost what you have to do every year, year over year. And I know that's a big deal to Brent, so I've got to think that's something that means a lot to him. But again, I just like where I like what he's about. I like where he's coming from. And like you said, George, he's so ingrained with that Brent Venables stuff. Like we've, I know we've all done our background stuff and reading information, and we've all read the stories about, he's, he talks like Brent, he acts like Brent, he walks like Brent, all that sort of stuff. I think that is what gives Brent Venables the confidence when he's got guys like Todd Bates, Miguel Chavis, now with Zac Alley, Brandon Hall. These are all guys that have spent a lot of time with him, and I'm sure that gives him a lot of comfort in saying, I can hand this off to these guys, and I can just be the head coach and worry about that job and that role.
Well, it's not the same thing. The similarities between him and Miguel Chavis, particularly on the recruiting side of things, they seem to be almost kind of the same. I know that Zac Alley has done a lot more in terms of on-field coaching and not coming into a role that is his first basically stop like it was for Miguel Chavis. But I would think that you don't rise up the ranks of the coaching industry like Zac Alley has without having some ability to go into a home and recruit guys and build relationships with current and players that you're trying to get to campus.
Well, and guys, a lot like with when Brandon Hall came in, I was like, people were a little shaky, and I think they gave him some leniency because of his time at Oklahoma. But I was like, guys, this is a guy that's recruited Georgia, Alabama, Florida, all these areas that Oklahoma was going to have to recruit to become an SEC program. Same deal here. UL Monroe, Jacksonville State. This is a guy, I look at some of the players he's landed. I mean, again, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. You just run down the list. So I think that only gives more credibility. And I know the instant question, I kind of referenced it earlier, is, well, how can he recruit these elite guys? To be fair, we don't know. Like, I mean, that you can't pretend there's information there that's not. But at the same time, when as much as I've dealt with high school coaches for 20 years, the guys that come in are there constantly, have the energy, like we would expect anyone that Brent Venables is associated with to have, and do so for the 2- and 3-star players. They're not going to have any trouble having the relationships they need to lean on when it comes to 4- and 5-star guys. So I think there's a lot of upside here. I know people will look at his age and be concerned, but I mean, this is a guy that checks a lot of boxes. And guys, we can pretend that Brent Venables is just going to walk away from the defensive room. We know he's not.
Yeah.
Like we know he's still going to be in the kitchen checking in on things, and he'll know when things are wrong, or, hey, we got to look at this. This is a problem, those kind of things. And I think that's perfect. I know I complained a lot about Brent Venables really needs to just be the head coach, let someone he trusts take over and be the defensive coordinator. And that seems to be what they're doing. And, all that George heard last night and reported, that's got to be music to OU fans' ears, because that's exactly what I think they needed. And I think it's what they're getting here. And there's also just a lot of continuity.
Here's the question, and this is for both of you guys. Do you believe that Brent can do that? Just from his personality and the way that he's operated the first 2 years, can he really do that? And maybe I'm naive, but you see Zac Alley, you've seen how, his mentorship or being called the protege of Brent. Maybe there is a trust factor there that he didn't have with somebody like a Ted Roof, that he can let him go do his own thing and he can step back and worry about everything else that a head coach has to worry about in 2024, being the head coach at a football program, and especially at a program like Oklahoma.
I think if it was somebody other than Zac Alley, I would say that Brent couldn't do that. And that's not to say that Brent, I think it will be an adjustment for him. I do. I think that there's going to be times this spring, maybe even early next season, that he's going to have to catch himself and maybe take a step back. But from everything I've heard, this is a guy that Brent really attached himself to at Clemson when he was just a student. I mean, this is a guy that I talked to a couple guys that either played or coached at Clemson when Zac Alley was there. Zac Alley used to wake up and live in Brent Venables' office. I mean, they were staying up, making play sheets together, putting the game plan together. This is a guy that I think Brent trusts completely, somebody that he's been looking to hire for a while, and it finally happened this way. They're going to run the same defense. Zach's going to call it very similarly than how he's called it at Clemson and Oklahoma. I think it gives you more confidence that Brent can do that. Whereas if they would have, just promoted a Todd Bates or something like that, then I think, yeah, of course, Brent's probably still going to be running the show. But I just think that Zach is somebody that he thinks has a really bright future at this. I mean, there's people that think, within the next few years, he could be a head coach. I mean, this is very similar to, and nobody wants to hear this as OU fans, but it's very similar to when Oklahoma hired Lincoln Riley. They brought him in as somebody that was an offensive mastermind and that everybody thought could be a head coach very soon. This is the same scenario with Zac Alley. I think there's a lot of people that have been around him that think, yeah, he's only 30, but give him a few more years at a big program like Oklahoma, and he could be a head coach somewhere.
Well, and to back up George's idea, when Brent was hired, the first three names I heard on the defensive side were Brandon Hall, Todd Bates, and Zac Alley. I think that was a very real thing even 2 years ago. I think that was something that Brent really looked into. At the same time, I think at that point, Zach needed to cut his teeth a little bit. He needed to run a defense. He needed to show something more than just, hey, you're going to be the 27-year-old whiz kid, kind of like what George is talking about with Lincoln. It was the same sort of idea, because we know, guys, that also Brent thought about bringing Wes Godwin in, who ended up being his replacement at Clemson, the defensive coordinator. So I think this is what Brent wanted to do 2 years ago. I think that a year ago, he knew for this team to have the momentum it needed to have to push into the SEC, they couldn't run the risk of being 7-5 this year. They had to be defensively efficient, and I think he felt like this is what I'm going to have to do. So again, I don't know that this past year was what Brent had envisioned, and and now that I see this move, it kind of makes me think that's not the case. Like that wasn't what he had planned. Even though I think my thought 6 months ago was that, oh yeah, this is what he always wanted to do. He was going to run the defense like Lincoln Riley would run an offense. But I think Brent knows. He's seen Dabo, he's seen Bill Snyder, he's seen Bob Stoops. He knows that the model that finds the most success are guys that are the head coaches, and they still have a role. Guys, we know Nick Saban's working with the DBs. We know Kirby Smart's working on the defense. But they aren't guys calling plays. They are putting talented people in position and letting them run the show. And this is something we've talked about on the pod, on YouTube. I mean, so this isn't like a new revisionist history. I like this move. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it checks a lot of boxes. My biggest question is just, what does it look like at OU's level, whether it's recruiting, whether it's on the field. If he can manage that step, which you know he's seen. I mean, he spent 7 years at Clemson. Like, he knows what a major program looks like, how it operates. So I think it can be fine. It's just you've got to take it from, theory to actual practice.
I think something we don't give Brent enough credit for, and Josh just kind of talked about it, is he's very calculated. This hiring Zac Alley, like Josh said, he's been on his radar, and I think he knew going into this season he had to take over the defense, like Josh said. I'd even say the Seth Littrell thing, when he brought him in as an analyst, I think he saw the writing on the wall that, hey, Jeff Lebby probably isn't going to be here as long as we think he is, and Seth Littrell would be a perfect replacement. Obviously, they know each other for a long time. So I think that these moves, the way that he's made these hires, he's had this planned out. I mean, just like how quickly this happened. I mean, it's no coincidence that Roof is let go on Thursday, and a couple hours later, we're breaking the news that it's going to be Zac Alley. Like, he's clearly talked to Zac Alley. He's had this in the works, even if Ted Roof may have not have known about it a week ago when we talked to him about at the Alamo Bowl. But I do think that this has been something that has been on Brent's radar. Talking to people close to Zac Alley, I think it's something that he's been looking for. I mean, even talking to Tyler right now, sounds like they knew at Jacksonville State that he's probably going elsewhere after this season, and it makes a lot of sense that it's Oklahoma.
In terms of
go ahead, Josh. Go ahead, Eddie.
No, go ahead.
Just real quick, two things. First, T's and P's to Bob Prisbillo, who did a lot of transcribing from that Ted Roof interview and has almost nothing to show for it. That's a brutal reality. But the other thing I want to say, and kind of again to back up George's point, I'm pretty impressed with Brent Venables. Like, there was no whisper. There was no, you weren't hearing stuff. And not only does he get rid of a guy, but he's brought in the replacement. I mean, that's stuff that, I mean, guys, we watch coaching searches all over the country, and there's all sorts of leaks and information and that kind of stuff. Man, there was nothing like that. It's really impressive.
Brent Venables, not a fan of the hot board. That's what we found out on Thursday. This has been a common question amongst the fan base, and I don't think that there's anything to it, but I do want to offer it to you guys. Does this alienate anybody like a Todd Bates, Miguel Chavis, Brandon Hall, Jay Valai, that basically, I'm not going to say weren't considered for the job, but they did go younger. They did go to a spot where I think that there's a lot of people out there that think, oh boy, did they piss off Miguel Chavis for this promotion? I would lean towards no. I think that certainly the trust in Brent runs deep just as much as the buy-in from the players. There's a buy-in from the coaches as well. There's nothing to that. Would we all agree?
I think the one that you immediately think of, and it's because he is going to be a hot commodity every single offseason, and that's Todd Bates, because he's regarded as the top defensive line coach in the country by a lot of people. So you wonder, is he upset in any fashion because maybe he wanted to be the defensive coordinator? I don't think that's the case. And again, this is a guy that Todd's worked with, Zac Alley. I mean, Zac Alley was a graduate assistant when Todd Bates was first hired at Clemson, so I'm sure he's very familiar with him. So, I mean, and I don't know this for a fact, but I just don't – Todd Bates doesn't strike me as somebody that would be upset by this. He's already got, obviously, the co-defensive coordinator title to his name, and I think that he knows that, he's in a good spot and that, he could go get – I mean, if he really wanted to be a defensive coordinator, I'm sure he could go get that job, somewhere if he wanted to.
Yeah, with Miguel Chavis, you guys know it. I mean, like, there's nothing but just unending appreciation for Miguel Chavis. Like, I think he feels like he owes so much to Brent. I don't think Miguel has any illusions that he was ready for that step. Like, he's still squaring away the defensive end room, and like obviously had a mountain of work upon him when he arrived, and there was a lot to change from the prior staff. But with Brandon Hall, it's kind of the same deal. Like, I just don't see any reason there would be an issue there. But with Bates, I don't think there is. I don't have any reason to believe that. But you could see it. I mean, it's a storyline you could at least like, okay, yeah, I could get there. He was co-DC. You let go of Roof. It makes sense. There's a natural evolution there. It adds up. Now you wonder, kind of like what Dabo did before Bates left, when Clemson, signed him to a new contract and gave him a new title and really tried to do a lot there to entice him to stay. you wonder if Oklahoma, he becomes associate head coach or, something along those lines to just further build his resume, because George is right. There is a point in time when Todd Bates won't be at Oklahoma because he's going to go on to bigger things and, a bigger role somewhere. And, maybe it's at Oklahoma. I don't know. But he's not he feels like a guy that's not going to be Oklahoma's defensive line coach forever, because he's a smart, sharp guy, and he can recruit at a position that is always in demand. And, we're watching him rebuild Oklahoma's defensive line room when I think a lot of people wondered if that was ever possible 2 years ago.
Let's talk about moving forward. You move into 2024. Zac Alley is going to inherit, maybe on paper, one of the best defenses that Oklahoma has put on the field in a decade. What is realistic in your opinion, Josh, just in terms of, we've seen the progression from year 1 to year 2 with everybody coming back, whether it be Billy Bowman, Danny Stutzman, DJ Terry, Jacob Lacey, Woody Washington. The list goes on of even guys that are very bright within the program that people think are going to have an excellent career. What is a realistic 2024 for Oklahoma defensively?
You guys know I'm a big metrics guy, and, I think there is a lot. You look at, Oklahoma's total defense or scoring defense, and it doesn't look that great. And then you look at FEI or SP plus, and all of a sudden you're like, okay, that's much better than I believe. Like Oklahoma ended up 33rd in SP plus defensively, which is, if that offense plays it the way that it can in 3 games, Oklahoma's in the playoff and, maybe playing on Monday night here. So it's all there for them. But to me, if you're looking, and I focus on the advanced metrics because I think it takes a lot more into account. I don't see any reason on earth why Oklahoma shouldn't be a top 20 defense next year. Like, there's not the dominating players up front that make me say, okay, it's a top 10 group. It's a top 5 group. Like, I don't see that. I don't think they're ready to go to that level. But their back 7 is as good as we've seen at Oklahoma in probably 15 years. I mean, there's just, to me, there's no arguing that. They've got depth. They've got talent. They've got NFL guys. And then up front, you've got some young emerging guys that, if R. Mason Thomas can stay healthy, if PJ Adebaroway can make that step, if Grayson Halton can step into a role and really be an impact pass rusher, if David Stone is ready to help, there are ways where I could say maybe top 20 is low. But to me, your basement needs to be a top 20 defense that is consistently getting off the field and giving the ball back to an offense that we all know, at least early in the season, we know is going to go through some growing pains.
And I think that the experience, Eddie, that is coming back also gives you a little bit more confidence in Zac Alley, because he's not coming into a situation where a couple years ago it would have been a disaster, right? Yeah. Like, he's trying to totally revamp a defense. He's taking over a group that is maybe the most experienced in college football next year, and especially at his position group that he's going to be coaching, which will be linebackers. I mean, you're talking about taking over a Butkus award, somebody that should be a finalist next year, Danny Stutzman, and really a whole group of linebackers that have played quite a bit of football now. I think it makes everything a bit more comfortable. I'm with Josh. I think this should be a top 20 defense, and depending on what metric you look at, I know everybody just looks at total defense. That's just not a good metric to look at. But like stop rate, I think is one that, Max Olson with The Athletic does a really good job with. Jacksonville State was 8th in the country last year in stop rate. And I know they're not playing, the teams that Oklahoma plays, but that is usually a good metric to say, okay, they're getting stops. They're getting off the field. And I think that that's something that Oklahoma can really pride themselves on. They're also really good against the run. I think they were one of the best run defenses in the country a year ago, which is something that Brent's talked about they need to be better at. And I think in the SEC, you're going to have to be good at. So I think the ceiling's really high this should be probably the best defense Oklahoma's had in maybe 2 decades. 15
I think you could
years.
say a decade for sure.
Yeah. It's up there. It's going to be, it should be one of the best defenses Oklahoma's had in some time.
It should be interesting.
Guys, I'm sorry, Eddie. I keep interrupting you, man. I apologize. I went back. You guys know me. I'm always going to go look at tape, and I want to watch some things. And I went back and watched some of the Jacksonville State Liberty game, which, I think that's the team on the schedule that people are going to be most familiar with, having just played Oregon. And until the Oregon game, only one team held Liberty to a fewer points than Jacksonville State. And Jacksonville State was in a 17-13 game until really Liberty scores 2 touchdowns in the fourth quarter to kind of make it 31-13. Looks a little uglier than it was in reality, but again, like you watch that game, you're going to see a lot of stuff that looks really familiar. And I think it kind of lends into George's point. I feel like we're just patting each other on the back here at this point, George. Where he's talking about, you can have some confidence in this guy because he's coming in with an experienced group. He's also coming into a group and not having to reinvent the wheel here. Yeah. Like they're going to be very familiar with his thoughts, his processes. I'm sure the vernacular is very similar. Like it's all going to be very familiar to these guys. And even if there are differences, it can be like, well, you call this bear, we call this tiger. I mean, it could be that simple kind of idea. And so it is, and I know people out there like, a bear front's a thing. I get it. I'm just trying to make an example here, people. But I think that only makes it easier because it's not like some seismic change where they're going from a 4-down front to a 3-down front, or their personnel in the back is going to be completely different. Like, this is very, very familiar to both him and them.
Final one before we get out of here. I think let's just put it flat out. Is Oklahoma better at defensive coordinator today than they were yesterday?
100%.
Yes. I don't mean to kick a guy that's down, but I again, this isn't me rewriting anything. I think I said it the day he was hired. I never loved that hire. I didn't see a track record that told me that was going to get OU's defense to where it needed to go. And with Alley, I admit it, the track record's short, but if Brent Venables sees the guy and thinks he can coach, okay. I know he hired Ted Roof. Like I hear the hypocrisy in what I'm saying, but I don't think there's any question that this is a very talented young coach that a lot of people, whether it was Oklahoma or somewhere else, like, we've already covered in this, someone was going to hire him to be their defensive coordinator, probably at the Power 5 level.
And the other thing too is to your point, Josh, is if Brent Venables trusts him, and I know he may have swung and missed on Ted Roof, and even Ted Roof, I think, brought some value to the program.
Like, they were better this year than they had been in a long time. Now, with that said, the bar was so damn low, there's steps that have to be made.
Right. But my point is, look at everybody else he's hired. I mean, name another coach on the staff that has not been a good hire that he has directly hired. I mean, you look at his defensive staff. Brandon Hall's done an unbelievable job. Jay Valai, Todd Bates, Miguel Chavis. They've all done a really good job. You even throw in Emmett Jones on the offensive side of the football. He's been unbelievable so far. We'll see what happens with Seth Luttrell at offensive corner, but I know a lot of people like that hire too. So I just trust Brent with this one, especially when it comes to a guy that he has worked so closely with at Clemson. And I get it. He was only a student assistant and graduate assistant, but clearly Brent saw something in this guy that he's wanted to bring him on staff multiple times, and now it's the right time to bring him in.
That's why, for me, the age thing really, as crazy as it is, I mean, the meteoric rise that he's made is unbelievable. It's pretty unprecedented. And like you said, George, it reminds us a lot of what Lincoln was at East Carolina. Because of that trust, because Brent Venables, I think, has a pretty good idea of what he's doing on the defensive side of the football, or installing or instilling the people that he wants to direct that thing, I just don't think it's that big of a deal.
No. And guys, what I think OU fans should probably take the most solace in, it's something I was a little out of pocket yesterday, so if I repeat something that's been said or covered, forgive me. It just was a day for me yesterday. But the thing that I think is really interesting, there was no heat on Brent Venables. This wasn't a move he had to make. I think OU fans should take solace. And after watching Brent Venables and even later era Bob Stoops, where I think there was some hesitancy at times to get rid of a guy that maybe wasn't quite cutting. It wasn't terrible, wasn't awful, but just wasn't quite to the level that, probably is needed at a place like Oklahoma. Brent just pulled the cord. I think that's a sign of a guy that will make the tough decision when he has to. Is not just going to stick to his guns and say, well, I'm going to go down with this ship. It's about getting it right. Like, if you get it wrong the first time, fix it. That's okay. There's no harm in that. And to go 10-3 and still say, hey, there's areas we can get better, I think that's a really good sign for Oklahoma.
Very good. Josh, we appreciate it. We will talk to everybody out there next time, probably next week. Hopefully at some point we'll have a introductory press conference with Zac Alley when he arrives in Norman. Well, I hope it's not next year. I hope it's at some point in 2024 in the calendar year. But until then, we'll continue coverage of everything that is Oklahoma's defense coordinator. A little bit more portal stuff. This probably would be the end of the portal stuff as Oklahoma prepares to start the spring semester. Josh, just in terms of what's out there or what's left, I know that there's a couple guys on the offensive line that Oklahoma's obviously needing to shore up. They did get the kid from Miami of Ohio. You look at the stat line, there's a lot to like.
Yeah, and this is a guy I've watched on tape, very active. He's what you'd expect from a MAC defender with just, I think, 12 and a half tackles for loss, 9 sacks, or I might have the half flipped on that. But he has been very productive for Miami of Ohio. High motor guy, real long. Is very much one of these guys that I don't know that he comes in as a star for Oklahoma or takes a starting spot, or I don't know about that. We'll see. But I think he's instantly a rotational piece. He gives you depth. He gives you experience at a defensive end room that I think we all know, guys. I mean, with the exception of Ethan Downs and, Trace Ford, whatever he may do going forward, there's a lot of youth in that room. I mean, especially of guys they expect to help. Like we said, with PJ, with R. Mason Thomas, that group hasn't played a lot of football. So I think having a guy like this to come in has some proven productivity. I think that's a really big one. And like you said, Eddie, then you kind of look going forward. I think it's really the offensive line with guys like Michael Tarquin from USC, who I think Oklahoma's in really good shape with, and then kind of some other guys with Armaj Reed Adams, the kid from Kansas, that I think is a pretty promising player. It's a question of who does Oklahoma see as guys that they want to come in, and because you don't want to upset the guys you have that you feel like can help you. But at the same time, you want to get the best talent you can. So if you're going to bring a guy in and that's going to upset somebody, you better be sure that guy can start for you and can help. And that's always obviously a highly debatable question.
41 tackles, 12 tackles for loss, and 9.5 sacks.
I knew I flipped it.
I believe to lead the MAC for Caden Woolard. So, yeah, it's interesting to certainly say the least. And we will be right here over at Soonerscoop.com, as well as right here on the Soonerscoop.com YouTube channel, continuing coverage as we move into January. Before we know it, spring ball is going to be starting, and we're going to be talking to Zac Alley, and he's going to be out there on the football field. So until next time, for Josh, for George, I'm Eddie. We will see you right back here on the Soonerscoop.com YouTube channel.